Uh, we have Ms. Gayani Hurulle with us today. She'll be conducting lectures on understanding research and scientific method for the Executive Credential in Leadership and Public Policy course, in short ECLPP. Ms. Gayani brings a wealth of knowledge in research, currently serving as a senior research manager at Learn Asia and also a consultant at the World Bank for Digital Development and Social Protection and Labor Practices. This is a common module that all students will experience in semester 2 of the Executive Credential in Leadership and Public Policy course. The course runs for 1 year and the particular lecture will be held over 2 sessions. So, my first question to you, Ms. Gayani, is could you brief us on the research component covered in the course, like specifically comparing a normal research project to a capstone? What's the difference of between these two?
Sure, thank you, Shani. Well, this module is all about answering the big questions in public policy, because public policy is all about answering big, complex problems which impact many individuals, right? So you're talking about what are, impacting climate change. You're talking about how do you educate future generations. So you're trying to answer a lot of big questions. So this is how do you,
in terms of different electives.
Exactly, and also in life, right, in different workplaces. If you work in public policy, those are the kind of questions you do tend to have to answer at various different scales. So hopefully what we will try to do through this module is to give students some sort of insight on how research can be used effectively to try answer some of those questions. In terms of a capstone, I think you can use research in various parts of your life, in various types of work. Sometimes if you go into, say, a research organization like where I work, you do tend to take on large research projects. And a capstone is really, will give you a flavor of that, in that you have to look at the various different knowledge bits that you've accumulated during a course, and then you try to apply it. So that's really what a capstone is, and hopefully this module will help achieve that.
True. What are the specific research topics will you be covering in the module?
Right, so I'll cover a couple of different topics. The first is an introduction to evidence-based policymaking, which is a big part of what this module tries to cover. Then go a little deeper into various types of research methods. So then we could talk quantitative versus qualitative, which is essentially numbers versus stories. Look at demand side versus supply side, which is one way that we often think about it. In terms of demand side is often about going and interviewing people and getting those sort of insights, versus supply side is about using administrative data or something of the sort, right? So there are various different lenses to look at research and data. And this will hopefully give students some sort of flavor of that. So that's one element. Then a bit of a deep dive into literature reviews and really trying to synthesize existing evidence. And that's really important in today's culture of, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There are sometimes sort of lazy studies and research done, which is not very rigorous.
ChatGPT is also there now.
Yeah, and that's a really important part of this conversation as well, because that's increasingly becoming a way that people get information. How do you use that effectively? And that's a much longer conversation to have. I don't think we can avoid using that in research and in life, but how do you use that effectively? How do you use it responsibly? How do you use it in a way that you can actually sort of gain knowledge and go back to the sources while also trying to achieve your final goal, right? So how do you really pass through that? And then also talk about research ethics, which I think also links back to this conversation about how do you cite well, when you go and interview people, do you get consent, how do you get consent, all those nitty-gritties we'll try to cover. It is a wide area of work, and so, but hopefully we'll be able to give an introduction which will then enable students to later go deeper and then apply it into their work.
Some lecturers, they do encourage in terms of choosing a research type, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. What do you, recommend our students in terms of public policy, the electives they are going to choose? Do you think they should choose qualitative or quantitative research?
Yeah, honestly, it depends, right? And I know it may sound like a bit of a cop-out answer, but honestly, that is the reality. One thing that will help determine which type of research method you use is what type of question are you trying to answer. So even in the type of work that I do in poverty and social protection, if you're looking to answer the question of how many people are living in poverty, then you would use quantitative methods, right? Like I would use surveys. But if you're trying to understand, okay, what are people's attitudes and perceptions of a social protection program, then you would use qualitative methods, right? So it really depends on the question you're trying to answer. It'll depend on, resources in terms of, time, various other constraints that people have, access to data, because sometimes you can go and interview people, but sometimes if you have the right data which is open and available free of charge, perhaps that's something that they could utilize. Something else is also skills, right? If you have a sociologist, for example, in the room, they may be better suited to do qualitative research, but if you have someone who's a data scientist, for example, they could capitalize on their existing skill set to really do some really exciting quantitative analysis. So depends on a various, set of factors, which hopefully we can help guide them to understand what sort of data sets, questions, time constraints will all fit together to answer the right questions.
So my next question is actually, when you evaluate research, what are the vital components you will look at, in a research, a final, project report?
Right. So one thing that I find quite useful, which students also may find useful, is this concept of a hierarchy of evidence, right? And that's almost, you think of it as a pyramid, and we can go into more detail on this later. But at the very top, you have this particular type of study called a systematic review, which is a very specific question that has been asked. And then some scholars have spent a lot of time trying to go through all the various the literature that's available in the public domain, or perhaps even through various different journals, and they've looked at all the different studies in the area. Then they've gone through all the methodologies and then looked at what is credible and what is not. They've done the hard work essentially, and then given an answer to that question, right? So sometimes that's actually what in our framework, what we think of as the best evidence. Sometimes they do an additional level of analysis called a meta-analysis, where if there are various numbers, they actually synthesize all that and say, okay, this is the effect that it's going to have. So that's at the very top of this hierarchy of evidence. And then at the very bottom is anecdotal evidence, right? What you'd hear from your neighbor or your friend. Now, of course, if they are a sort of expert in the area, you would think of it differently, but that's at the bottom, right? So that is one way that I have found is quite useful to think of, okay, what is good research and what isn't? And then there's a lot of various different types of research in the middle, right? So the big question for researchers and policy intellectuals is also how you make sense of all that. Even if you take surveys, that may be somewhere in the middle. You have good surveys and bad surveys, right? You'll have things that are done with large sample sizes, that have gone through rigorous sampling methodologies, where the right questions have been administered, it's been analyzed well, so that's quite different to a non-representative survey, for example, right? So all these are various different factors that one would have to go through when evaluating research.
Right. Finally, Gayani, what is the advice you would give to participants, like in terms of completing their research on time, because they have to complete this during the second semester. And how do you think because we have most of the students are professionals, they are working currently, what is the advice you would give them to in terms of time management and completing the project on time?
I'd honestly say a lot of the work would have to go in at the beginning of scoping out your project, right? So define a research question that is both of interest to you, which you'd like to work on, and also something that is manageable, right? In the context of this, something you may
related to your work, or,
exactly, right? So there may be a natural synergy there, but really make it manageable at the beginning so that then you don't go through the sort of this entire process where you later realize that it's not workable and then you have to backtrack. So scoping it out at the very beginning, I think, would be the most useful piece of advice I can give, and then also come out, be curious and come with an open mind.
So thank you so much for joining us. I think this will help most of the students to understand the type of research they'll be doing during the second semester. Once again, thank you so much, Gayani, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.